easy, oh. Lesson time, baby. Oh, so easy, oh. Country African boy. Oh, so easy, oh.
What's up, y'all? I'm Lex-Jordan Ibegbu, and thank you for tuning in to Wahala Talk. Today, we have a very special guest. We have the Attorney General from North Carolina, Mr. Josh Stein. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to speak with me, Mr. Stein. So we'll get right into it. I'll start off by asking, so we are aware of the incidents in Alamance County with the Sheriff's Department there during the early voting. And at this point, it seems that local law enforcement has begun to engage in some aspect of intimidation and retribution against elderly voters and pastors by charging them with felonies. So what can be done to curtail this seemingly partisan and discriminatory use of an arm of government?
Well, one thing, I have been honored that Governor Roy Cooper has asked me and Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Anita Earl, to co-chair a task force, the Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice. And what he asked us to do was to have a very broad view of the criminal justice system and identify ways in which there are racial disparities and address them, identify reforms, and then work for their implementation. And we're in the final stages of that work. We have more than 100 recommendations that we've approved, and we'll be making our formal report to the governor in mid-December. We put as one of our recommendations was for there to be the development of model policies for police departments to facilitate peaceful protests. Obviously, First Amendment protests is highly protected political speech and foundational to the way our government came into being and how we have improved as a country over the centuries. And so making sure that when these protests are occurring, that there's excellent communication and proper facilitation between law enforcement and the citizenry. And so that is a recommendation that we're going to be bringing to the Criminal Justice Training and Standards Commission, Sheriff's Training and Standards Commissions, which oversee law enforcement officers, and hope that they can work with us to produce some best practices that law enforcement agencies across the state can deploy.
So you mentioned that you are the chair of the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice. Now, we know that drug convictions and in general, and marijuana convictions in particular, disproportionately affect African Americans. However, we know that the use is about the same. Their report was issued requesting the decriminalization of marijuana in small amounts. However, we know this decision is ultimately in the hands of other parties, whether that be local county district attorneys, the legislature, or the governor. Now, we saw in New Jersey that the attorney general there essentially sent the mandate through when he saw that the ball was moving too slow, because while we wait, real consequences are happening to people's lives. So what can you do such that your recommendation and the reports that were issued don't fall on deaf ears?
Different states empower their attorneys general differently. So just for an example, in New Jersey, the attorney general there has original prosecutorial authority, meaning that when someone commits a crime, breaks the law, they're the ones who are the lawyer in the courtroom acting as the prosecutor. That's not how we're structured here in North Carolina. In North Carolina, there are independently elected district attorneys who are responsible primarily for prosecuting crime, and they're constitutional officers, just as the attorney general is a constitutional officer. There can be times when there's a conflict or for some reason, maybe resources, that the district attorney can turn to the attorney general's office. I have a special prosecution section and ask for our assistance, and we will provide it in those instances. But I don't have the ability to tell to district attorneys how to do their job. I can make recommendations, and that's one thing that this task force is recommending. You are correct that when it comes to marijuana in particular, that research demonstrates that white people and black people use marijuana at similar rates. But when you look at who is prosecuted for using that drug, it is disproportionately African Americans. That more than 60% of people arrested and convicted for marijuana possession are African Americans. And so from a racial equity perspective, that's not acceptable. We need to, one of the best things we could do to unclog our courts and empty our jails would be to just decriminalize marijuana. That's why our task force made that recommendation. For there to be a change in the law, that obviously rests with the General Assembly. So they are going to have to decide, debate, deliberate. Someone has to introduce a bill, and then they have to pass and enact a law that changes the sanction for marijuana possession. What we recommend is that it be a civil infraction, like a speeding ticket, where you have to have a ticket, pay a ticket, and we think it should be a low dollar amount. But that you shouldn't get an arrest record. You shouldn't have to go to court. You shouldn't have to go to jail for marijuana possession. And so that's a recommendation. We're going to make, or urge the legislature to act on it, but we can't dictate what the legislature does. We also similarly made recommendations to local law enforcement that they deprioritize arresting people for marijuana. Even if the legislature doesn't change the law, each agency can determine what its priorities are. Are they going to spend more time on the street arresting people for marijuana possession? Are they going to spend more time trying to clear out a backlog of untested sexual assault kits and solving violent crime? And we urge them to go after crimes that really affect public safety and not something like marijuana possession. And then again, district attorneys, even if law enforcement make an arrest of somebody for marijuana possession, the DA has discretion about what cases to bring to trial and which ones not to. And we urge district attorneys to deprioritize prosecuting these types of crimes if the legislature doesn't change it. But I can't make any of these folks do any of these things. That's why I'm using my bully pulpit to do the best I can to advance the criminal justice system in a way that will treat more people equitably and fairly.
Understandable. So let's pivot a bit now. You have filed various lawsuits against different private actors, the Trump administration, surrounding the protection of our environment here in North Carolina. And so I'll just ask your personal ideology, how can our environment be made to be a human issue rather than a partisan issue, because it affects everyone? And then secondly, do you see these suits as a way to curtail the greed of business interests in contrast to the balance of our environment, or will the process need to essentially go at a larger problem as to how these business interests gain access and influence in this regard?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, obviously we care about natural resources, but we also care about how the natural resources impact our lives. And we have to have clean air to breathe, or else people will suffer respiratory illness. We have to have clean water to drink, or people, if they take in certain chemicals, can develop cancers and other sicknesses. And so that's the key, is making that link between having clean natural resources, clean environment, and impact on human life. And so that's a lot of what cases I've brought. I brought cases against the Trump administration for weakening the air emission protections. And I brought lawsuits against the Trump administration and private actors for polluting our drinking water. And so that's what we try to do. Basically, we have laws on the books to ensure that our air and water are clean because of exactly that, keeping people's health paramount. And so when companies violate that law, that's when enforcement comes into play. Department of Environmental Quality enforces the law in the first instance, and then we go to court as the lawyers for the Department of Environmental Quality to uphold those enforcement actions. And it's critical that companies not cut corners, not short shrift measures that can keep our environment clean and in the process keep us healthy. And when they don't do those things, they're cheating. they're cheating us because we suffer the health consequences, but they're also cheating competitors who are doing things the right way and putting in the money to make sure that they're filtering out the pollution. And it's fair, enforcing the law against wrongdoers is fair also to competitors who are doing things the right way.
I understand. So you also spoke about the focus of upcoming lawsuits and pending lawsuits on big tech. So the question is twofold. Firstly, how do we allow smaller actors to gain access to this market so as to further innovation and distinctions? And then also, how do we protect the consumer's information from different influences and different parties who may have access and engage in some sort of mutuality with these companies?
Well, protecting people's privacy is really important. And we have laws about security breaches, about what companies must do when they have a security breach where our information is compromised. And I'm just about to announce one against a company called Sabre, which does reservations for hotels across the country. And they had their system compromised, many people's credit card information stolen. And what we believe is that companies not only have to notify people when these breaches occur, but they have to do a better job safeguarding our information in the front end. And one way that incents companies to do a better job protecting our privacy is through competition. And when you have dominant actors in big tech where they control the entire segment of a certain type of the internet, whether it's internet searches or whether it's social media websites, and they are able to use that power to maintain their monopoly, where whenever there's any kind of competitor who might arise, they're able to just buy them and snuff them and put them out of business, or incorporate whatever technology into their own network, then there's no one applying market pressure on them to do a better job safeguarding people's privacy. And that's one of the reasons why I'm looking at a number of these big tech companies and am investigating them, and part of a multi-state effort of Democratic and Republican AGs to do so. Because there's different types of consumer harm. There's obviously financial consumer harm, where if somebody's a monopoly and they control the market and you need to use them to get whatever it is you need, they can charge you a high price and you're stuck because there's nowhere else to go. So that's one way consumers are harmed. But consumers are also harmed when companies short shrift things that are important to you and me, like making sure our privacy is protected. And if there's no one on the other side keeping them honest as a competitor, then the big tech companies' willingness to invest what is necessary to keep our information private is diminished.
So what would you say to those on the other side who would say too much regulation, too much intervention stands in contrast to market efficiency?
Well, I'm a proponent of market economies. I think that it's the most efficient way for our needs to be met. It produces the greatest wealth and the greatest consumer satisfaction. It's definitely the superior way to organize an economy. But that said, we have to have rules of the road, and a market can be distorted if some company is a monopoly and is able to use their scale in order to maintain that monopoly to the detriment of snuffing out competitors and putting innovation on the back burner, but also that ends up harming consumers who have to pay more and suffer through the loss of innovation. And that's the law in a market economy. It has been that way over 100 years in the United States, anti-monopoly laws. And I am a major enforcer of the rules of the road. So whether it's a big tech company or any company violating our antitrust laws through monopolization, through collusion, through price fixing, or if it's a company that's polluting our drinking water and hurting people through chemicals, or it's a company that's out there deceiving consumers and trying to take money by misrepresenting what their products are, I'm going to enforce the law, because those rules whether they're consumer or environmental or antitrust, those rules serve to enhance all of our qualities of life. And it is not inconsistent with the value that we derive from a thriving market economy. In fact, it's preservative of the market economy. It ensures that competitors are treated well. And we actually have a competition between who has the best product or the best service. And it's not one company cheating to the detriment of the other and detriment to consumers.
And lastly, I know you have to go, so I'll just say, your previous term as Attorney General, you were in an unprecedented climate. So given the Trump administration, given everything that was happening in North Carolina, we're at a bit of a crossroads as a country and as a state. So what is your outlook now that you have been newly elected for another term? Congratulations.
Thank you.
And how do you want to push forward and learn from the wisdom that the previous years have given you?
Well, I am obviously thrilled at the prospect of being able to keep doing this work for another four years. And I'm so grateful to 2.7 million North Carolinians who voted for me. I'm going to keep doing the work that we've been doing, which is all about protecting people and every person in the state of North Carolina. But one thing that this election did underscore is how politically competitive North Carolina is. We're truly a 50-50 state. I mean, I won with barely more than 50% of the vote. So I know that to be the case. But we're not only politically competitive, we're also politically divided. And there's a lot of hostility and even demonization of the other side. That if you're not on our team, you're on that team, and that team is somehow flawed and wrong. And we can have differences. We can have respectful differences. We can have significant differences, but we have to be able to engage the other side in a forthright and respectful fashion and try to find areas to work together. Find areas where there is commonality, understanding there will be other issues where we just don't agree, and we're going to have to keep fighting it out in the public and let the voters ultimately determine how they want to go on a specific issue. But it requires a little more humility on the part of all elected officials.
Most definitely, respect is paramount. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for taking the time out to let me ask you some questions. When things slow down and open up, we'll have to have a further in-depth conversation, and that will be much appreciated. But until next time, thank you for tuning in to Wahala Talk. Much blessings and peace.
Thanks, Lex-Jordan. See you, man.
See ya.
Country African boy.